The pen barely made a sound when Lydia O.C. signed her name on the last page. No tears, no shaking hands, just the quiet scratch of ink on paper, and then silence. Her attorney, a compact woman named Miss Fournier who had seen the inside of too many courtrooms to be surprised by anything, slid the documents into a manila folder without ceremony. Across the table, Lydia's soon-to-be ex-husband, Ethan Marsh, watched her with the particular expression of a man who had expected a scene and was quietly disappointed not to get one. Beside him sat Caitlin Webb, his assistant, his affair, his big mistake, dressed in a pale blazer, who had the decency to look at the floor. Lydia capped the pen, set it down, picked up her coat from the back of the chair and walked out. She didn't look at either of them, she didn't need to. Outside the law office on Bay Street, Toronto was doing what it always did in late October, cold, gray, efficient, the kind of city that didn't pause for your heartbreak. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 4 seconds, watching a streetcar grind past, and felt something she hadn't expected: relief. Her grandmother Nana Abina had told her once that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was let a man see her cry before the game was over. Cry when you're alone, she had said, sitting at her kitchen table in Scarborough, shelling peas into a bowl with the steady rhythm of someone who had lived through worse than whatever Lydia would ever face. Cry in your car, cry in the shower, but never let them see you fall apart before you've finished standing up. Lydia had been 19 then, newly heartbroken over some boy whose name she could barely remember now. She'd thought her grandmother was being dramatic. She understood now. She had known about Caitlin for 8 months before she filed. 8 months of cooking dinner with the knowledge sitting in her chest like a stone. 8 months of watching Ethan check his phone in the bathroom, of noticing how he'd started calling her Han again, the performative affection of a guilty man, of tracking the small erosions of a marriage hollowing from the inside. The private investigator she hired was a retired OPP officer named Malcolm. He was thorough, discreet, and cost her $4,000, worth every cent. He documented restaurant lunches in the Distillery District, an overnight in a hotel near Pearson that Ethan had chalked up to a work conference, credit card charges at a jeweler on Yorkville Avenue, a necklace Lydia had never seen, which meant it had gone somewhere else. She had kept the file in a cloud folder she'd named Q3 Budget Projections. While Ethan was busy being careless, Lydia was busy being methodical. They had met at a graduate school orientation 12 years ago. She was finishing her MBA at Rotman. He was doing a second master's in urban planning, which he never actually used. He'd been charming in the way that some men are charming, not with effort, but with ease. The kind of ease that can look like confidence until you've known someone long enough to see it's actually just in curiosity. He never needed to try very hard because things had always come to him. Lydia was not that kind of person. Lydia had always had to try. She grew up in the kind of household where nothing was assumed. Her mother had emigrated from Ghana in her late 20s with a nursing degree and $1,700. Her father drove a transit bus for 22 years. They were proud people, stable people, but they were not people who told their children to expect the world to make room for them. You made room, you showed up early and stayed late, and you always had your documentation in order. That was what her mother had said when Lydia told her about the divorce. Not "I'm sorry," not "I told you so." Just, "Do you have everything documented?" Lydia had almost laughed. "Yes, Mama. I have everything documented." She had started OC's Partners Architectural Consulting 3 years into her marriage, right around the time Ethan's career in planning had stalled and he'd transitioned into development consulting, which meant, in practice, that he worked for a firm run by a man named Dorian Ashworth who paid him well and expected him at networking events every other Thursday. The job looked good. The salary was good. But it had a softness to it that Ethan had started to absorb, a comfortable reliance on someone else's name and someone else's clients. Lydia's firm, by contrast, was hers. Every client, every contract, every difficult conversation about budgets and timelines and structural compromises, hers. She had 3 architects under her and a reputation that had taken 7 years to build, the kind that spread the way good reputations do. Slowly, through referrals, through showing up and delivering. What Ethan had never quite understood, and what she had perhaps never quite communicated, which was her own failure, was that the firm wasn't just her career. It was her architecture for everything. The way she thought, the way she planned, the way she built things that were meant to last. He had thought she was distracted by work. In the end, she was just paying attention to the right things. The marriage had started sliding in year 4. She could see that now in the clear-eyed way you could only see things after the fact. He had started making small comments about her schedule, about how she worked like she didn't have a home to come back to, about how other women in their circle managed to be successful without being so, and he would trail off, not finish the sentence, which was worse than if he had. She had tried. That was the thing she needed to say, at least to herself. She had suggested couples therapy. He had agreed to go 3 times and then found reasons to cancel. She had cleared her calendar for a trip to Costa Rica that he'd been asking about, and then he had pivoted, said the timing wasn't right, they'd go another year. She had made herself smaller in 100 ways she didn't recognize until she started seeing her therapist, Dr. Yuan, who had a calm office in Cabot and the gift of asking exactly the right question with exactly the right amount of silence afterwards. When did you stop expecting things from him? Dr. Yuan had asked once. Lydia had stared at the middle distance for a long time. I think, she finally said, I stopped expecting things from him around the same time he stopped expecting anything from himself. She had not told Dr. Yuan about Malcolm's file, or about the precautions she had been quietly taking since the spring. Some things you don't say out loud until they're done. The precautions had started small. She'd moved her emergency savings to a separate account in her name only. Something she'd been meaning to do for years, and that Ethan had never asked about because he was not a man who paid close attention to financial details that weren't his. She'd had a meeting with a lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Ms. Fournier who specialized in family law and who had gone through Lydia's situation with the systematic focus of someone diffusing something complicated. Your firm predates the marriage, Ms. Fournier had asked. Incorporated 4 years before we married, Lydia had confirmed. And the intellectual property, the client relationships, all in the company structure. I own 70%. My business partner holds the remaining 30%. Fournier had made a note and nodded with the faint satisfaction of someone who found things in order. Good, that matters. It mattered because Ethan, in the months leading up to the separation, had started making comments about the firm that had a different quality to them. Comments about how they were partners in everything, about how her clients were basically their clients, about how he'd sacrificed his own trajectory to support her building the business. She had listened to those comments with a carefully neutral face and quietly understood what they meant. He was preparing a narrative. Lydia had prepared one too. It was just better. The divorce filing had caught him off guard. She had moved out on a Thursday morning, methodically while he was at work. She had hired 2 movers and a locksmith, and by the time Ethan came home at 6:15, her personal files were gone, her grandmother's hutch was gone, and there was a note from her lawyer on the kitchen counter. He called her 4 times that evening. She let them go to voicemail. His messages moved through a predictable progression: confusion, then hurt, then the particular aggrieved tone of someone recasting themselves as the wronged party. The 4th message was something about how she was making a mistake and how they should talk like adults. She had called him back once, from her new apartment on Danforth, in a neighborhood she had loved for years, and where she had signed the lease 3 weeks before she filed. Lydia, he had said, answering on the first ring. Where are you? We need to. I have nothing to say that isn't already in the legal documents, she said. Everything goes through Miss Fournier from here. She'd hung up before he could answer. Caitlin, to her credit or perhaps her tactical sense, had stayed invisible throughout. Lydia had expected Caitlin to be the kind of person who inserted herself, who needed to be acknowledged as real, as chosen, but Caitlin had been quiet. Maybe she was smarter than she looked. Maybe Ethan hadn't told her how it was going. Either way, Lydia didn't think about Caitlin much. She was a symptom, not the disease. The court date had been set for a Wednesday in late October. Cold morning, low sky. She had arrived first, which was deliberate. She was wearing charcoal gray, her good coat, the one she'd bought after her first major contract came through, the one that made her feel like herself. She'd worn her hair up. She'd slept 8 hours, which had surprised her. Ethan arrived with his lawyer, a man named Desmond who had the practiced geniality of someone whose job was to make unreasonable positions sound reasonable. Ethan had looked at her when he walked in. She had looked back, briefly, neutrally, and then turned to speak to Miss Fournier about something else. Caitlin had come too, which Lydia had not expected but also did not especially react to. She had sat in the hallway outside with a coffee and her phone, a woman waiting for someone else's outcome. The proceedings were straightforward. The agreement had been largely negotiated, not without difficulty, not without Desmond trying to introduce the idea that Ethan's contributions to the household had indirectly supported the growth of OC Partners, a claim that Ms. Fournier had dismissed with a completeness that Lydia found privately satisfying. The marital home would be sold, proceeds split, a retirement account divided, the firm, protect. When it was done, Ethan's lawyer leaned over and said something to him quietly. Ethan nodded slowly in the way of a man recalibrating. Lydia signed her copy, Fournier countersigned, and that was it. She picked up her coat. She said nothing to Ethan. There was nothing to say. What happened next she had not planned. She had planned the 3 weeks prior, yes. She had planned the apartment, the movers, the documentation, the legal strategy, the financial separations. She was an architect, she planned things. But she had not planned for the call from Gordon Whitfield. Gordon Whitfield was 63 years old, a Vancouver-born developer who had moved his operations to Toronto 6 years ago and who was, depending on who you asked, either the most exacting or the most impossible client in the city's construction world. He demanded precision, hated wasted meetings, and had a reputation for firing firms mid-project when his standards weren't met. He had also, quietly, transformed 3 neighborhoods and built 2 of the most talked-about mixed-use developments in the country. She had met him once at an industry dinner 2 years ago. She had spoken for about 7 minutes about a sustainable retrofit project her firm was finishing in Hamilton. He had listened without interrupting, asked 2 specific questions and moved on to the next conversation. She had not thought about it again. He had called her direct line on the Tuesday before the court date. "Miss O.C.," he'd said, without preamble, the voice of a man who considered small talk an inefficiency. "I've been looking at your firm's portfolio, the Hamilton project, the Leslieville conversion, the commercial development on Queen West. I have a project, a significant one. I'd like to discuss whether you're the right fit." She had been standing in her new apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and she had looked out the window at the quiet, tree-lined street below and said, with perfect calm, "I'd be glad to have that conversation." They had met the Friday after the court date, in a private dining room at a restaurant in the financial district that did not have its name on the door. Gordon Whitfield arrived precisely on time, shook her hand and placed a folder on the table. The project was a 17-story mixed-use development in Calgary's East Village, with a mandate for LEED Platinum certification and an architectural vision that the developer who'd originally been contracted had failed to deliver. He needed someone who could come in with clarity, move fast and build something that would still be talked about in 30 years. The contract value was in the range of 8 figures. She had asked 3 questions, he had answered them directly. She had said she would have a formal proposal on his desk within 10 days. She had walked out of the restaurant into the gray October afternoon, stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and thought about her grandmother shelling peas in Scarborough. "Cry when you're alone. Never let them see you fall apart before you've finished standing up." She hadn't fallen apart at all. She heard about Ethan's situation secondhand, the way you heard about most things you'd stopped keeping track of. Her old friend Keisha, who moved in wider professional circles than Lydia did, mentioned it over lunch in November. Ethan's firm had been restructuring. Dorian Ashworth's development company had lost a major project tender and made cuts. Ethan was among those transitioned out, which was the phrase his sector used for let go. He had called her twice in November. She let both go to voicemail. The first message was practical, something about a document she might have. The second was less so. It was the middle of a Tuesday afternoon and his voice had a quality in it she recognized. Not grief exactly, but the particular deflation of sorts about themselves had stopped working. She listened to it once, deleted it, and called her project coordinator in Calgary to go over the timeline. In December she ran into Caitlin Webb at a pharmacy on Bloor Street. Caitlin had seen her first and looked like she was calculating whether to pretend she hadn't. Lydia saved her the trouble by making brief eye contact and nodding, the minimal acknowledgement of someone who had moved so far past a thing that it didn't require a reaction. Caitlin nodded back. They each went in different directions. That was all. The project announcement came out in March, a press release from Whitfield Properties that named OC Plus Partners as lead architectural firm on the East Village development. The architectural and construction press picked it up. Her firm's inbox had 3 days of unusual volume. She gave a brief interview to a trade publication that asked good questions about the design philosophy, and a less good question about balancing work and personal life, that she answered with enough graciousness to not let it derail the conversation. Her mother called after reading the article. "It says the building will be 42 meters, her mother said by way of opening in the tone of a woman who had long ago decided that practicality was its own form of love. 43.5, Lydia said. The article got it slightly wrong. A pause. Her mother breathing on the line. Your father would have liked to see this. Her father had died 4 years ago, a Wednesday in February, which was the wrong day to die, but he hadn't chosen it. He had worked every day of his adult life. He had driven his bus in the dark of early morning and the dark of early evening, and he had come home and sat at the table and asked how her day was, every single time, as if the answer might surprise him. She had learned from her father that the work was the thing, not the recognition, not the arrival, the work. "I know, Mama," she said. In April, Gordon Whitfield sent her an early birthday message. Her assistant must have flagged the date and added a line about the project being in good hands. She showed it to Keisha over wine that Friday. "Gordon Whitfield sent you a birthday message," Keisha said, with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. "About the project," Lydia said. Sure, she didn't need the story to be about a billionaire or about a man. She was aware of how the narrative could look from the outside. Woman survives bad marriage, catches the eye of wealthy developer, triumphant exit. It was a tidy story. People liked tidy stories. The truth was less tidy and more hers. The truth was 8 months of sitting with something she knew and not letting it destroy her focus. It was Dr. Yun's office in Cabottown and the particular silence after a good question. It was her grandmother's voice. It was the cloud folder named Q3 budget projections. It was a lease signed 3 weeks before a court date, and a firm built over 7 years that nobody could claim, and a phone call answered with perfect calm while standing in a half-unpacked apartment. It was not a rescue. It was the result of her own architecture. She poured more wine. Keisha was asking about the Calgary site visit next month. She was talking about whether they'd have time to eat somewhere good. Lydia leaned back in her chair and thought about the building. 43.5 meters, LEED platinum. 30 years from now, people would walk past it, and they would not know her name. And that was fine. The building would still see standing. She liked that. She had always built things that were meant to last.